Kia ora koutou katoa. It's great to see all of you, big interested audience in this important topic. Thanks for your introductions, Rafe. So I'm just going to start things off, and then we're going to rotate between Maibritt, myself and Amy to present the bulk of the presentation, and I hope we'll have a good time for questions. So just to set some context, and I will actually do that by referring to the teaser questions, I'll call them, that we put in the introduction to our talk. Primarily, how will Wellington Central City develop as we gradually recover from COVID? But hang on, can we even assume that we are actually in a post-COVID period? How does population growth, forecast population growth, affect that recovery or development period? And then relating it to the topic that we're going to spend most time talking about, what does that overall development pattern have got to do with the supply and the demand for green spaces? And then in the wider context, what about the ongoing climate change and biodiversity crisis, and of course a number of other sustainability and planning issues, most of them pretty urgent, confronting us all in Wellington and central Wellington. And there's been quite a lot of talk and headlines, some quite dramatic headlines in the newspapers just in the last couple of days, cramming 80,000 people into the city, and the crushing of our green recovery period if it started. So you'll all have your own views about those questions, and I hope, well, we will say a little bit about each of them, and perhaps give a bit of, try and pack them together as well as we can in this short time. I will say a few brief comments about two or three of those aspects just now. Firstly is the population projections. So the current population of Wellington City, the whole of Wellington City, about 215,000. And you'll see that that is slowly growing, or I would say steadily growing, and quite rapidly growing, particularly in the first 10 years over the period to 2043, just under 25 years. This varies slightly, but most of the projections aren't as dramatic as that 80,000 figure that's been circulating quite frequently in the last few years. But I think it is clear that there's two main factors that are going to affect this rate of change in population. One is migration, both within New Zealand, within the region itself. Where will people want to live? Will it be in the central city? Will it be other parts of the city, other parts of the region? Secondly is the pattern of commuting, and we saw some very, very rapid changes during the lockdown and then afterwards, and then we seem to be creeping back to normal, but there is a lot of talk about reduced commuting into the city. There are about 76,000 people added to the 200,000 odd population of Wellington, central Wellington, every working day of the year. Climate change. So two factors that I think are very, very pertinent to this discussion. One, sea level rise. That is fairly well known, that sea level rise is going to affect parts of the Wellington, particularly the waterfront areas, quite significantly. It's also going to affect groundwater levels. Another factor that flies more under the radar, but I think is equally significant, is the higher intensity rainfalls that are expected. So this is data that's available to Greater Wellington in their climate change information. So this is just looking at the most rainy days in the year, the 2 or 3 top rain days in the year. On those days, there will be about more than 25% increased rainfall. That's that high intensity rainfall. Now that factor, together with rising sea levels and rising groundwater levels, is certainly going to exacerbate the mapped and modelled flood forecasts, of which I've shown one on the right, in the coming decades. So why do we focus on green infrastructure and green space in the central city in response to these very broad issues? Our argument goes roughly like this in summary. So contact with nature is very important for the health and well-being of all of us. Maibritt is going to say more about this. I don't need to say any more than that, but that is really a given now. It's well established. For urban residents, most of the contact is provided by urban green spaces and the blue spaces. We're not going to talk about that so much today, but of course Wellington, as a harbour city, does have great accessibility to its blue spaces. Now they provide many other values. A lot of people call them ecosystem services, and this photo of Matairangi just illustrates a few of the many values that are provided by urban green spaces. So with these multiple values, it adds up to the argument that urban green spaces are a critical part of the city's infrastructure, as critical as the road infrastructure and the sewage infrastructure and the water infrastructure and so on. I like this very generalised definition of green infrastructure, a systems definition, as a network that provides ingredients for solving urban and climatic challenges by building with nature, as opposed to trying to keep nature out. Finally, we just have to remember that in the central city, most of our green infrastructure needs to be provided for by the council, either directly or through policy. So with that in mind, some of you will know that a couple of years ago the City Council provided a brief to the Centre for Sustainable Cities to look at the supply and demand of green spaces in the central city, assessing both the current provision, the current and the future demand in terms of the population, and to make some recommendations about that. So that's, I will talk a little bit about the results of that survey shortly, but first of all I want to hand over to Maibritt to give some very important sort of why as well as how answers.
Kia ora koutou. No waikatoa hau engari ko porirua te kāinga I nai nei. Hi everybody, thanks for having me. Here we go, here's my first slide. So we do often talk about the benefits of urban blue and green space and infrastructure, often from a human well-being perspective when it comes to inner city design. Obviously, if we have more urban green and blue space, then we have increased resilience to climate change as well as increased ecosystem health. And if we're strategic about how we design urban green and blue space in terms of increasing ecosystem health, then we can increase the provision of something called ecosystem services, which in turn also increases human well-being. So if we're really strategic about urban green and blue space, we're increasing our own well-being through these other means as well. And we can think about increased human well-being in terms of physical health, psychological health, obviously, which often is about the individual, but collectively there's also these benefits which occur. There's some quite fascinating research out there actually about decreased rates of violence and increased socialisation. We linger longer in green places. There are a lot of proven economic benefits to increased urban green and blue space as well. We will pay more for a view, we will pay more for a product that is linked with nature somehow, and security. And I'm not just making this up. This diagram here is from the Millennium Ecosystem Services Assessment, which was way back in 2005 now. But they go through quite carefully and map how exactly ecosystem services are related to constituents of human well-being. So I won't go into that, but it is there if you want to look into it a little bit more. So in the report that I co-authored the report with Paul along with a whole lot of other really fantastic people, including Rafe and Philippa who are here, and other people in the audience. One of the things we were doing was trying to push this idea of being a little bit more strategic with how we design things. And we were thinking about ecosystem services in the Wellington context. So you probably might know about ecosystem services, I'm not too sure, but typically they're broken into supporting services. That's the stuff that enables ecosystems to function, to kind of exist. Regulation services, that's things like purification, climate regulation. Provisioning services are things we know really well. That's like provision of energy, freshwater, food. And then of course we have cultural services. That's the stuff like, is it beautiful? Can we have great recreation here? Does it express our culture? All that kind of stuff. And we're typically very good at the cultural ecosystem services side of things when we design urban green and blue space. But we tend to sometimes forget about other ecosystem services that we could have as part of our design goals for urban green and blue space. So in that report, we looked at 3 or was it 4 case studies. One of these was the Cuba Quarter Green Nexus. So we were mapping, where are the car parks, where are the earthquake-prone car parking buildings that are going to be pulled down, where are the petrol stations? What would happen if we reimagined this into a kind of a nexus of green space and connected that with existing parks? And while we were doing that, it could be beautiful, it could be a great place to eat our lunch and things that we usually think about, but we could also think about that in terms of habitat provision and purification of water and prevention of disturbance and resilience. So it's just about adding another layer to our thinking when we're designing these spaces. And that leads me into talking about the importance of connected green spaces. We don't experience the city just in separate sites. We move through it either walking or biking or at speed in a car. But we're always experiencing the city through time as connected experiences. So in terms of human well-being, it is important that we think about how these places are connected. This is an image from the Wellington Nature Map, where I, along with a few other colleagues, were trying to map elements of biophilic design in Wellington. So biophilia just means a love of the living, and it's just playing on this innate trait that we have as humans to want to affiliate with nature and understanding that that does us well, physiologically, psychologically, and culturally. And I won't go into that too much, but it's a really fascinating area of study. So we were mapping these areas, and we found that there are zones of intensity, there are areas which are biophilic in Wellington. Wellington is a biophilic city. It's a self-nominated thing though, so I was a bit dubious, which is why I did this map. I was like, oh, is it biophilic? I think maybe it is. It could be. We can also think about the importance of connected spaces in terms of biodiversity and ecology. So I had a PhD student that was looking at how far various keystone bird species can actually fly that are able to distribute tree seeds around the city. And that led on to another student who was able to spatialise this and say, well, actually, we do need to have more of these stepping stone habitats between places like the Greenbelt and Zealandia. And interestingly, one of those key places where we need to have like a place for birds to stop and do their thing happens to be in Te Aro, which is where we identified in the report as a place which doesn't have a lot of green space and is densifying really fast. And Paul will give you all the stats on that later. So one of the projects I've been doing with my students, I work at the architecture school at Vic, is this Wellington Inner City Greenbelt or block. So we're thinking about urban biodiversity, but also human wellbeing. And that's it there, the red bit. So goes up Taranaki Street, along Courtney Place, down Kent and Cambridge, and is bounded on the fourth side by Pukeahu National War Memorial. And our idea here was that we can't necessarily find a whole lot of park space. We can't sort of bowl down a block of buildings and have urban green space. But what if we started to reimagine architecture itself as green space? Could we have more green roofs? Could we have more green walls? Could we incorporate wetlands? Could we do all those kinds of things and not be bound stylistically or aesthetically? There's lots of different examples around the world that do this. So I've had 12 students last year, 17 this year working on this idea, and they've been playing around with, well, what kind of structures would we need, what sort of materials, what kind of species would be suitable, and what kind of programs. So I'm just going to flick through some of that work, and you'll see up on the top a little key which shows you where around that belt they're working. This was an interesting one, looking at bringing back wetlands around basin reserves. So they're tying into the flooding issues that we have. This was one which was looking at bringing people through from Courtenay right through the ocean again. It was a project looking at celebration of Pacifica people. So a series of islands essentially connected by these boardwalks through an urban wetland. And my students were looking at ecosystem services as well. So this is a project where the student was experimenting with a kind of zinc-based facade in order to soak up pollution from cars, which is along Vivian Street. So this is corner of Taranaki and Vivian. And there's some interesting work that's been done around the world on that. Other students, my fifth years, were looking at whole streets, so mapping which particular rooftops would be good for water, retention, for energy generation, for green roofs. Another student looking at urban biodiversity along Kent and Cambridge. This year I have a fifth year student looking at bringing back Wellington's lost stream. So there's a stream, Waitangi stream, that goes underneath Kent and Cambridge. Could we bring that back? How would that work in terms of biodiversity and transport planning? And I just want to end on talking about another project that, just a very small project that we did during lockdown. So just to bring this back to COVID. This idea of urgent biophilia is really just about the fact that when something happens, like an earthquake or a disaster or a pandemic, we will actively seek out nature more than when we're just in a calm state. And we wanted to test that idea, I guess. So my intern, who was from Utrecht University, Rebecca, I don't know, are you here, Rebecca? Yes, so there she is. You can talk to her about this afterwards if you like. She was stuck quite near Tanera Park. We had to stay in our bubbles, so she did all this in her local park. She set up a little installation where you had to put a stone in jars to say basically why you were in the park. And then that was followed up in the various levels that we went through with questionnaires and various other things. So I'm just going to very quickly explain this. Essentially, a lot more people visited the parks more often. That's the key takeaway. And it was very, very clear. And it was roughly split between wanting to visit the parks for exercise and recreation, but also for mental well-being. Why mental well-being? Well, a large proportion of people said that park visits helped them to process their emotions, and these were some of the emotions that they talked about in the questionnaire. So it's very clear that people were actively seeking out nature at that time. So these are some of the insights. The first two I've talked about, but there was a rediscovery or an enhanced interest and realisation of the value of local nature for many people. So what does this mean in a post-COVID world? Well, we need to understand responses to socio-ecological upheaval. That's really important. And the climate crisis is likely to increase the frequency and severity of events. We need to consider who gets access to nature. So there are issues of social justice or environmental justice which come into it. But crucially, urban green and blue design needs to be much, much more strategic. We need to really have better goals for what we're trying to achieve with our green space. And lastly, there is an opportunity to harness a refreshed appreciation of the value of green and blue space because we have just been through lockdown. So if you want to know more about that particular project, there's some links there on the side. There was a little documentary made in a Stuff article. So with that, I'm going to pass back to Paul.
So what I'm going to go through in the next few minutes, it's a lot more prosaic than these wonderful ideas and design ideas that Maibritt and her students have been presenting. But I hope, but also I think important to sort of build up this case. So we're talking about the actual places that you will know, the urban green spaces in our central city. So it's important to emphasise that this is not just the parks and reserves, the area that's called such and such park. It was a fairly widely defined to include places like road reserves and also spaces that are quite park-like, but they happen not to be called parks and reserves in the City Council tenures and typologies. They're administered by other parts or Crown-related organisations, council-related organisations. We also had to look at the different kinds of vegetation cover. I won't go into that, but basically whether it's trees or grass areas or horticulture is quite important to thinking about what services these green spaces perform. And it's important to note that it also includes a lot of paved space and impervious space, the typical park or road reserve. So that is also a component of our allegedly green spaces. There's an interrelationship with the blue spaces I've mentioned, and we haven't talked about private green spaces in our report, but we've certainly been thinking about it, and that is also an important type of interaction. So we used 3 different census area units as the basis of our study because we could get population records to work out availability. So most of you will know Wellington well enough to know that these 3 census area units, Thornton, Tinakori in the north, Lambton around the Golden Mile and the Terrace, and then Willis Street, Cambridge Terrace, the Te area. They've got some quite interesting differences between them. Not the least the differences in population, which you can see in the right-hand table. So Willis Street, Cambridge Terrace has got quite a lot more inhabitants, residents, than the other 2 CAUs. And the growth is going to be higher in that area as well. That's where a lot of the existing and planned intensification is happening. So the population projections that we used, and this was based related to 2013 figures, were for a 90% increase in population overall. That was under a high growth scenario though. So these were actually the results in terms of the total amounts of green space. Now, I know there are quite a few figures in here. I suggest that perhaps you just look at the ones in red. On the left-hand columns, you see that it's broken down by the type of land cover. So probably the most important takeaway is that of the 42 hectares in total that we mapped, the area between the 3 census area units varied quite markedly. So Willis Street, Cambridge Terrace, which was the smallest, which was the most populous CAU, had the least amount of green space, and in fact within that that total green space of just over 7 hectares, the largest single component was in fact paved impervious surfaces. Thornton and Tinakori and Lambton were more dominated by trees, some discontinuous, some more continuous. That is probably the most important takeaways from the overall analysis of area. Now, you put this together with population levels, and this is where it gets interesting in terms of availability. So again, this is 2013 figures, but and then I'll mention the 2043 projections. So you can see that the green space per capita, the 2 right-hand columns, it's a simple division of the amount of green space. That's the total green space divided by the population. There's a very striking difference. Overall result of 20 metres per person for the central city area. It's twice as high as that in Thornton Tinakori, about the average in Lambton, but quite a lot lower, less, only 40% of the average in Willis Street, Cambridge Terrace. If you take those population projections to 2043, those differences become strongly exacerbated. So there's basically a 50% reduction per capita over the whole central city. That is assuming there's no new supply of green space, and we'll come to thinking about that aspect. So it's an important caveat. Overall, there's a 50% reduction. It's about that average in Lambton. It's a little less severe in Thornton Tinakori, But in Willis Street, Cambridge Terrace, which is already the poorest served, it is more strongly exacerbated that shortage. So that is a very, very low amount per capita by international standards and compared to what we think of as Wellington as a biophilic city. I think I'll have to skip over the spatial reconstruction of that, but maybe we might come to that if the discussion goes that way. The conclusions of our supply and demand analysis, I think, are pretty self-evident from that last table, that the supply of accessible green space to the current population is unequally distributed between those 3 census area units in the central city, and that those inequalities will increase, I think, quite strongly as the population grows at different rates in different parts of the city. So we would certainly argue that as the population increases and the housing density increases, which is desirable for a whole lot of reasons from urban design perspective, but the case for improving the supply of green space increases strongly. Haven't stressed the accessibility issues, but people who are young or parents of young children, people who are old, people who have any kind of disability, many of the green spaces on the edge of the city are not easily accessible to those people, and also the quality, even once they've got there, whether they can use that for those kinds of nurturing needs that Maibritt talked about, that becomes a consideration. So certainly the quality of the green space is important as just its supply. So just thinking about the provision of green space as Wellington does become more dense in the central city. So thinking here just in very broad terms about the interaction of green space with other urban infrastructure that I mentioned in those introductory slides. The different kinds of infrastructure, but also the interaction of public green space with other accessible green space. And this is where we weren't able to get the full picture, but the green space on the waterfront, the green space that's in central government buildings or properties, around churches is quite a significant item in Wellington. And then private residential green space also has values for the public in terms of the streetscape. That does help augment the council green space. But overall, we think that this analysis provides a strong argument that committing real expenditure into green space as the city intensified is vitally important if we want to maintain the quality of life and those other co-benefits that Maibritt's talked about. There are benefits to property owners and users and residents, and also to these commuters, these very large numbers of commuters who don't require green space 24/7, but they do have requirements for some amenity from the green space during their leisure time while they're in the city. So Amy's going to talk about some of the imaginative ways in which these green spaces can be provided. And I have to just point out that one of the strongest competing uses for green space specifically is car parking. Not so much the moving cars, it's the parked cars that really provide the competition, if you like. And I imagine we might have some discussion about that. And we are suggesting that council can lead the way with policies to encourage and, where necessary, require green space provision. So I don't need to go into the recommendations. We provided some quite detailed recommendations, but the overarching recommendation was really what we have been talking about so far, to for the council to plan for increased availability, accessibility and quality. All those things have to go together, of green space in the central city to provide those many values that we've been talking about. And perhaps the overarching message that I would like to leave in terms of the concept is that green spaces and the blue spaces should be seen as vital infrastructure and an integral part of urban ecosystems that Maibritt's talked about. That is as important as the physical infrastructure that we are so worried about at the moment. So Amy has been a really important part of the Wellington City Council's response to our report, as well as other really neat planning work that she's been doing related to green spaces. And so she's going to talk about what the council's going to do about all this.
So kia ora tātou, ko Amy Hobbs, toko ingoa, ko ako mahi hoi hoi taoni. Ka pai Paul Maibritt, thank you so much for going through all your research and the wonderful work that your students are working on, Maibritt. And just wanted to take a bit of time to reflect on that work actually, because it's really, really important in terms of what we as a council can do going forward with our green spaces. It basically provides a baseline for us to work from. It provides that knowledge, that evidence base, and it's also going to allow us to measure success over time. So I've been tasked with, I guess, the response to the research, doing what any good council does, write another plan. And so yeah, I'm a landscape architect undercover as a urban designer, so there we go. But yeah, so what are we doing? So basically the response or the idea is a green and blue network plan. And we want to enable good informed decision making. We want that to end up in our long-term plans, see how that influences district plans and the like. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And I guess it's more important now than ever with climate change. We're actually starting to see the effects of these cumulative effects of possibly, not doing as much as we could. And of course, with lockdown level 3 and 4 particularly, we saw how our cities can be when our nature is given that chance to breathe again. So some of the benefits that will potentially come out of this work relating to, economic, if we just pull out a few of these, there's a lot of evidence around the CapEx costs can be reduced with green initiative and building. Longer tenant tenure, happy tenants, the likes of it. Walking the clean green talk, not sure if I've got a pointer here, there we go, and ecological. So Wellington, a city set in nature, how can we actually achieve that for our central city as well? Health and well-being, so I guess the social, usually you'd see social with the sustainability. A lot of these deliver really good social outcomes. So resilience, we've already talked about climate change, but social equality, how can these greenscape spaces touch a number of different people? So just a bit of scene setting, I will talk a little bit about planning for growth because that is actually about to be launched again for some more public consultation. Possibly around about the 10th of August, going to council on the 6th. And from our city tomorrow, from what we did in 2017, we've already heard that people want to see green. And above, I guess, sits this as a regional growth plan, and above that, the National Policy Statement for Urban Development, which was gazetted last week, and that talks about well-functioning urban environments, and I guess that well-bit is that qualitative aspect of what we're trying to achieve. So council plays an important role in interpreting that, and I guess the areas of influence as well with the spatial plan, how we can work alongside that and influence the district plan as well. Te ata kura, our first to zero. So it's basically, I guess, putting action to the strategy or the many strategies that we do have. So part of what I've been doing is going through all of these strategies and policies that we do have and pulling out the relevant bits. So we're already doing a lot of really good stuff And I guess now with the critical massive support through climate change and COVID and the health epidemic, it just makes the case even greater for why we're doing this. And regarding the pandemic, it's not our first, it won't be our last. So our open space, our streetscapes, and that all play a part for how we go designing our cities moving forward. So a few snapshots from 2017, what people were saying at the container that we had out there. So all of this has been captured as well in the planning work. The Central City Spatial Vision, which we sort of picked up on and thinking of as a draft vision for our green network plan, green-blue network plan as well, talks about leading healthy lives and how we can do that through our green capital city. And I'll just cover a few sort of themes, principles that we're playing around with. So I'll just let you know, this is really kind of early thinking. None of this is actually set in stone. I was saying to the others, this presentation has probably forced me to condense the thinking a little bit as well. But there's only one Wellington, so let's cherish our flora and fauna. Let's assess our existing spaces using the ecosystem services base model. Our treasures, we have a wonderful town belt, a wonderful harbour, but possibly that might have left us to be a little bit complacent about what's actually green in our central city. And Maibritt already pointed out about the stepping stones between the green belts and connecting it. Making nature visible. So we do have some great things in Waitangi Park already. And we know that if we can, this is not new thinking, if we can make nature a bit more visible, we can learn to live with more water in our lives. We've just got to go that step further and just make sure that we're actually doing right by our green spaces and what we do have, and making sure that we have line items in our asset management plans to look after these spaces. We also know that we can sequester more carbon by having nature, particularly through trees. Now, trees actually tick many boxes for biodiversity, and they're also big in terms of carbon sequestration. I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. Nature doesn't really have cadastral boundaries, so this is really about working across land ownership. So council could go and put in a bunch of pocket parks, but if on our private lands we don't have those stepping stones as well, we're not going to get the biodiversity that we need or support it. And I guess thinking green within any project that we do. So I've just popped up a slide of the Tussing Square, which apparently was Copenhagen's first climate adapted urban space. So this actually handles a lot of rainwater. So other than an amenity space in a place that looks good, it's also functioning on another level. So some draft topologies that we're just sort of playing around with in terms of the language around how we might assess existing spaces and then possibly allocate, new spaces or partner to create different spaces is happening here. We already have our suburbs reserve management plan, which has topologies, but they didn't quite fit in the central city, and that plan also doesn't cover the central city. So parklets and pocket parks came through quite strongly in the research report. Also, linear parks, they can touch a lot of people. Potential doesn't have to be a park; it can be tree-lined streets, so that can be alongside active transport projects. I'm particularly thinking about Let's Get Wellington moving. Trees are a big part of that as well. And then the green roofs and walls and our sustainable urban drainage systems and water-sensitive design. I guess as we have paved over a lot of our cities, we do need to look at other methods for managing the increased water flow from all this paving. So the Stedstan rooftop garden, again, is in Copenhagen. They change their menu weekly, it has great views of the city, and it's also a nice space to be in. So initial mapping that we're doing, working alongside Studio Pacific Architecture, who's helping us just take that next step for needs assessment and gap analysis. As you can see, there's not as much green space as you think, and we're just starting to think about how we might think about or divide these spaces up between pocket parks, parklets, city parks, destination parks or anchor parks, and what the level of service might be for each of those areas. Again, just conceptual. Trees, so this is on our GIS, so we have 128 species recorded in GIS, and this is just our central city area. So you can see this doesn't pick up private trees, but you can see that we don't actually have as much as we think. We also have no notable or heritage trees in our central city area. People, of course, can nominate trees. We're doing quite well with our restoration, planting in our reserves, so I see sort of 50,000 there, small plants, about a 15% mortality rate, but they're only about 10 centimetres high. In our central city, our planting with trees, we have no street tree planting budget, so it's aligned with CapEx projects. So there's 4 new trees that went in at Grey Street, 6 in Denton Park, Lombard, but 3 trees came out of there, and then 5 trees were planted to replace others. So again, that's sort of telling a bit of a story. So Parklets, and I've actually been working alongside Chris Herman as well, who wrote a paper with Maria Rogers, Tactical Urbanism. So I've got some links as well that I can share later, but I recommend that you read that. But this talks about parklets taking over 2 or 3 car park spaces, typically on road reserve, but I've also just popped up a couple of slides on parklets that appear on private land as well. So this example is just on Bulcott Street, near the Wilson parking, and this one here is next to the James Cook Hotel. So just a point that these spaces are also really important for that matrix of what's happening in our green spaces. Some pretty cool stuff happening in San Francisco. The proprietor for the Shipwreck Park wanted a space, and of course he could do that as long as it wasn't just for private business but for public as well. Fresh Air Park in London, in the summer this is very green, treed and leafy. In the winter there's a bit more light through, some signage there. And Sao Paulo Park, this was one of first of 45, I think, that also enabled council to reduce or to make it easier for proprietors to navigate the regulatory system to get spaces like this up. Pocket parks, so Derbyshire Park in Street is interesting because that was an old road. It's next to a bigger green space, but the gardens are working to manage water, and there's some downpipes and everything that flow into the space. So an old dead-end road, cars parked there, now is this space for community benefit as well. And Franklin Street, again, this is in Cambridge in America, and 2003, but old concreted area and just repurposed. So we can actually get a lot, I think, through potentially repurposing some of our road reserve areas, and we're just getting some calculations for how much council actually owns in the central city for roads, and what is that potential for green space if it's not being used as well as it could. So what will we end up with? Another plan, I said, but and there's a lot of question marks on these, as we're working through this in response to the research, but it's really about influencing decisions and aligning our green and blue initiatives with big projects. So I just realised I was standing away from the mic, hope you could hear me okay before. So of course, let's get Wellington moving, planning for growth. I do suggest you jump online with Let's Get Wellington Moving as well, and put your thoughts on the Golden Mile that's out at the moment. Our long-term plan, our roading and utility projects, so us partnering with Wellington Water, what is going to happen with Kent Cambridge Terrace? Parks and streetscapes, working closely with our private sector, looking at our potential areas for change, and possible recommendations that might come out of this work. Regulatory policy, maybe. Of course, identifying key relationships, looking at potential areas for strategic acquisitions. And there was actually a paper that my colleagues Stephen Lee put up in June 2019 last year, which looked at that, exactly that. And some of the statistics they had from that report said we need probably about 29 extra Glover Parks in Te Aroha alone. So just to give you a bit of a visual of the green that we're sort of talking about. Repurposing road reserve, street tree budget, that would be great. Bringing underperforming open public spaces up to a high level of service. So that's what we're looking at the moment, how our existing spaces performing. Justice Park, I guess, was an example on the corner of Lambton and I forget, Whitmore Street. That's where the Supreme Court is now. And back in 2006, there was a lot of calls for green to be part of that. So the question is, did we get the green that we wanted from that project as well? Yes, Justice Park wasn't performing as it could have been, but there's a few questions around that. Invest and deliver over time, so 3 and 10 years, and funding models, and of course management and maintenance. So I will flick to the last slide, our contact details.